I've only ever owned a couple of Hamiltons, but I'd say the brand is one of my favorites. Now, while Hamilton was originally an American company, it is now a Swiss company owned by the Swatch Group. So while their watches are Swiss-made, their designs originate more from their American heritage, particularly with a focus on military and aviation. Now, if you love tool watches, but divers aren't your thing, then Hamilton's going to be your go-to company, as they seem to have the nice sweet spot between quality and price. So one of my regrets from last year was that I only ever reviewed one Hamilton, and that was the Hamilton Khaki Mechanical. I think I did back in early March. I think that was right before they got really popular. Now, I had plans to do more, and I actually bought this Khaki Aviation in summer, but things got in the way and I just never got around to it. So here we are finally taking a look at that Khaki Aviation. And if I'm being honest, there's not a whole lot that I'd say is aviation about it. To me, it looks more field watch. But before we get into that, let's first take a look at the dimensions. So width here is just over 38 millimeters without the crown, and just over 41 millimeters width. So for everyone wanting me to look at smaller watches, here you go. Yet even with a slightly smaller frame, it doesn't feel too small, mostly due to having a very minimal case around the dial. So most of the watch's presence on your wrist is just dial. Lug to lug is about 45.5 millimeters, so again, it's a nice compact frame. While it's just over 11 millimeters tall when it comes to height, so not too bad for an auto. The one odd thing here that I'm not a huge fan of is the lug width is 19 millimeters. So it's a little less common to find straps, but at least it's not 21. But since I usually don't have any other 19mm straps around, most of the ones you'll see on here are 18. Water resistance is also a little less than ideal at 50 meters, but should be sufficient for most people. And weight-wise, you're looking at 68 grams with its leather strap. So not too heavy and not too light. Just a good solid feel in the hand for its size. Now, price here is a little tricky. I'm not entirely sure, but I think this was discontinued recently, as it's no longer on Hamilton's website. Yet you can find it elsewhere on the internet. MSRP was around $740, but I'd say the average price should be around $400 to $450. Yet multiple times over this last year, I've seen it on sale for around $275. As I said, the case is rather minimal, mostly rounded with a brushed finish and with a very clean bezel on the front, as well as very short crown guards at the 3, which is matched proportionally by shorter lugs. Now the case is notched to help give clearance to the leather strap it comes with, but even then with some thicker NATOs, you're gonna have a tighter fit. The crown is at the 3, and it is a little small, but I think it looks good proportionally with the case, especially with the crown guards that sweep out and cover most of it. Even then, I've never had a problem pulling it out to manipulate it. The knarling is nice, and it is signed with a big ol' H for Hamilton. The brushed finishing continues to the rear with an exhibition case back that has a rather large crystal. Now, while the crystal on the front is sapphire, the back is just mineral. From top to bottom, the finishing is quite good, and what you should expect from a Hamilton. The dial is what initially interested me in this watch, as it reminded me of the Champagne Khaki King, but a little more cleaner. The color, hands, and chapter ring being the most obvious similarities. The dial is divided into 3 parts. The center has a small rounded area with a sunburst effect, and here you have the Hamilton logo at the top and Khaki Auto at the bottom. There is something about the Hamilton logo that I just love here. The font and sizing are just right as to show this watch for what it is, but not overwhelming to the point it crowds the dial. Beyond that, you have the hour indicators, and the dial here is in a metallic finish with more of a circular etching going outward. Nothing is applied, but a nice distinct black paint is used on the sticks and the Arabic numerals, giving a nice clear contrast. A small cutout for the date is at the 4:30 position. It's narrow, and interestingly, the date is oriented away from the center of the dial, so that if you have the watch on your left wrist and you're holding it up to look at it, the date will be pointing directly at your right eye. Which is fine if you're right-handed, But if you're left-handed and you wear your watch on your right, this may be a little hard to read, as now it's more oriented away from your face than towards it. Before you get to the third section of the dial, you also have the Swiss-made indicator, reminding you of what 60% you're really paying for. Now that last section is the rather detailed train track chapter ring. Now as I said, the hands are very similar to the Khaki King, dark black outline with a yellow gold loom center. I'm not exactly sure what type they are. They aren't quite syringe or sword hands. If anything, I'd say they are cathedral, although not quite classic cathedral. But whatever they are, I just love them, especially the length. The hour hand goes just beyond the edge of the sunburst section, while the minute hand goes just to the edge of the chapter ring. It's very well executed, including the second hand, which is an extremely long arrow of a second hand, which has a white loom tip and a black circular counterweight. And I just love watching this thing go around as smooth as it is, mostly due to the high beat ETA movement, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, while I love the overall dial layout here, I almost feel like there's something missing, and I'm not exactly sure what. Overall, it's a nice, clean, beautiful looking dial, but perhaps it's because it does look like the Khaki King, and because of that, it looks like it's missing something and a little off. Or perhaps because it's supposed to be an aviation-inspired watch, yet I'm not seeing any of that. I'm seeing more of a field watch design. But regardless, it is still a beautiful dial. Now, one of the things I love about the Khaki King is that it's a field watch that looks as good as some dress watches. So it's a watch that can pull double duty. And I think that's true here as well. But the opposite side of that is that perhaps this watch is too fancy or too nice looking for some people for everyday use, especially with that champagne colored dial. And maybe that's one of the reasons that led to it being discontinued, as some people just really weren't sure where it fit in the grand scheme of things. Which could explain this watch, which looks very similar to the Khaki Aviation, and maybe its successor. It's called the Khaki Air Race, which I think has the exact same case, yet with a slightly different dial. It's a cleaner chapter ring, and hands that look more aviation-inspired. So in some ways, maybe this air race has a clearer sense of what it is. Another difference here is the movement, which instead of the high-beat ETA 2824, it has a Hamilton's H10, which I believe is really just a modified ETA, which has a standard beat rate but 80-hour power reserve. Now, as I said, this one has an ETA 2824 movement, which is a high-beat ETA workhorse. So you have 28,800 beats per hour, hacking, hand winding, and a quick set date. It's very responsive and has a good feel when you set it. Not to mention, there is just something I love about listening to a high-beat movement. The finishing on the movement is clean, but nothing too fancy, with the exception of a nice custom rotor. Although I do prefer the look of the newer custom rotors on the H series of movements for Hamiltons. Now accuracy-wise, this is pretty good, gaining +6 seconds a day. So let's look at the loom next, and I believe it is Super Luminova. So I put this watch up against my new Orient Mako diver. Just looking at the hands, the Khaki Aviation is not initially as bright as the diver, but it's pretty close, and that's actually pretty good for a non-diving watch. And it really held its own after 40 minutes. So overall, I'd say the loom here is pretty good. On a side note, you may have noticed the San Martin Flieger was included in that test. And that's not really as much of a tease as I really was curious how it would compare, and I was surprised how well it did. Now I should have the review of that done in a few weeks. But back to the Khaki Aviation, and last but not least is the strap, which as I said is 19mm, and I really would have preferred 20. Otherwise, the strap is quite good. It's a nice, soft, pliable, yet thick brown leather, and it really didn't require much of a break-in period. I also really love the stitching near the case, not to mention the signed buckle, not only in how it operates, but because you could say that it's an H for Hamilton. With the strap, I would say the watch is a joy to wear. Its weight and smaller footprint lets you easily forget it's there, yet with that large champagne dial, it has a great wrist presence for when you need it. My only minor annoyance when wearing it is with its buckle. It seemed a bit excessively wide for a 19mm strap, and the edges are a little sharp, so it would sometimes feel like it was in the way. If you can find this on sale for less than $300, I think it's a good price. Not only is it a good price for a Hamilton, but it's a good introduction into Swiss watches. When it's not on sale, however, I think there are some better options out there, and particularly some that may not suffer from an identity crisis. Not to mention that you can usually get the Khaki King for less than $350. Now, while I like the Khaki Aviation, and I'm glad I got to spend some time with it, I'm not really in love with it. So I think I'll actually be selling it soon, if nothing else than to help fund a new Hamilton. Which one? Not really sure. Might be a Khaki King, or could be something different, or could be something really different. But in the meantime, let me know in the comments what you think about this Khaki Aviation, or if there are any other Hamiltons that you have your eye on. And as usual, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.